A battle that would change world history forever. A battle that would raise a young man just 25 years old into legend. That young man was Alexander the Great. With only 50,000 soldiers, he dared to face 150,000 Persian troops led by King Darius III, the largest army in the world at that time. But would numbers decide the outcome? And in 331 BC, which empire would become history? October 331 BC, on a vast, wind-swept plain near a small village called Gaugamela, in what is now modern-day Iraq, two armies prepared to face each other. This was not just another battle. This was the moment that would decide the future of an empire and the destiny of a young king whose name would echo through history. On one side stood Alexander of Macedon. He was only 25 years old, but already he had conquered Greece, crossed into Asia, defeated Persian armies, and captured Egypt. His soldiers followed him, not just because he was their king, but because they believed he was unstoppable. Alexander commanded an army of around 47,000 men, disciplined, battle-hardened, loyal. His infantry formed the legendary Macedonian phalanx, armed with long spears, called sarissas, stretching over 20 feet. His cavalry, the companion cavalry, was the most elite striking force in the ancient world, fast, aggressive, deadly. And at their head rode Alexander himself, a king who fought in the front lines, a commander who led every charge, a leader willing to risk everything. But across the battlefield stood something far more intimidating: the Persian Empire and its king, Darius III. Darius had spent months gathering the largest army the ancient world had ever seen. From every corner of his vast empire, they came. Persian cavalry, Median warriors, Babylonian infantry, Bactrian horsemen, Scythian archers, Indian troops with war elephants, an army drawn from 3 continents. Some historians estimate over 100,000 men. Others claim nearly 200,000. Whatever the true number, one thing was certain: Alexander was heavily outnumbered. Darius also deployed hundreds of scythed chariots, fast-moving war machines, fitted with blades, designed to tear through infantry lines. These chariots were meant to break formations, create chaos, and destroy discipline. And this time, Darius had chosen the battlefield himself, a wide, open plain. Perfect for cavalry, perfect for chariots, perfect for overwhelming numbers. Darius was confident. He believed this would be the battle that would finally destroy Alexander. But Alexander saw something different. Where others saw danger, he saw opportunity. Where others saw overwhelming numbers, he saw weaknesses. Because Alexander did not intend to fight a long battle. He intended to end the Persian Empire in a single decisive strike. 2 kings, 2 armies, 1 battlefield, and before the sun would set, history would change forever. This is the Battle of Gaugamela. October 28, 331 BC. Before sunrise, the plains of Gaugamela were already awake. A cold wind swept across the open terrain. Dust drifted slowly through the morning air. Thousands of soldiers stood in silence, waiting. This was not just another battle. This was the final confrontation. Alexander of Macedon against King Darius III, ruler of the Persian Empire. Both kings understood everything would be decided here. King Darius III had spent months preparing for this moment. After his defeat at the Battle of Issus, Darius knew he could not fail again. This battle would decide the fate of the Persian Empire. So Darius chose the battlefield carefully. The plains near Gaugamela, wide, open, and flat. Perfect for cavalry, perfect for chariots, perfect for overwhelming a smaller army. Darius ordered engineers to prepare the battlefield. Workers cleared rocks, flattened uneven ground, removed every obstacle. The entire plain was transformed into a battlefield designed for speed and destruction. At the front of the Persian army, 200 scythed chariots stood ready, each chariot equipped with long iron blades, mounted on spinning wheels. When they charged, they were designed to cut through infantry, break formations, and create panic. Behind them, thousands of Persian cavalry lined the wings, Bactrian horsemen, Scythian horse archers, Median cavalry, Persian noble riders. Their mission was clear: surround Alexander's army and crush it. Behind them, rows of Persian infantry stretched across the battlefield. Archers, spearmen, light infantry from across the empire. Near the center, war elephants stood beside Persian troops, massive, towering animals. Many Macedonian soldiers had never seen them before. Their size alone could cause fear. At the center of the Persian army, King Darius III, standing tall in his royal chariot, surrounded by elite guards, the Persian immortals, royal cavalry, noble warriors. Darius wore royal armor, decorated in gold and purple. From his elevated position, he looked across the battlefield and saw Alexander's smaller army. Darius felt confident. He had the numbers, he had the cavalry, he had prepared the battlefield. This time, Alexander would be defeated. Across the battlefield, Alexander prepared differently. His army was smaller, but experienced. These were veteran soldiers. They had fought at Granicus. They had defeated Darius at Issus. They had marched across Asia the night before the battle. Alexander rode along his lines. He spoke calmly to his officers, encouraged his soldiers, maintained discipline. Some of his generals suggested a night attack. They believed surprise could overcome Persian numbers. But Alexander refused. He wanted victory in daylight, clear, decisive, complete. Alexander believed discipline would defeat numbers. Before sunrise, Alexander carefully arranged his army. At the center, the Macedonian phalanx, veteran infantry, holding sarissas over 6 meters long, a forest of spears, difficult to break. Behind them, Alexander placed reserve troops. He expected Persian cavalry to attempt encirclement. Alexander prepared for every possibility. On the right wing, Alexander placed his strongest force, the companion cavalry, elite Macedonian horsemen, fast, disciplined, deadly. Alexander took command personally. He would lead the decisive attack. On the left wing, General Parmenion commanded the Thessalian cavalry. Their mission: hold the Persian cavalry, prevent encirclement, buy time for Alexander's strike. Now, 2 armies stood ready. One army, the largest the ancient world had ever seen. The other, smaller, but disciplined, and led by Alexander. The sun slowly began to rise. Golden light spread across the plains of Gaugamela. Armor reflected sunlight. Horses breathed heavily. Soldiers tightened their grip on shields and spears. Both kings watched the battlefield. Darius, confident in numbers. Alexander, confident in strategy. Silence filled the plains. Then, Alexander made the first move. Slowly, his army began to move, not forward, but to the right. Darius watched carefully, not yet realizing. Alexander had already begun his plan. The Battle of Gaugamela had begun. The sun rose slowly. Over the plains of Gaugamela, light spread across the battlefield, revealing 2 massive armies, standing face to face. Thousands of shields, thousands of spears, thousands of soldiers waiting. The air was tense. Then, Alexander made the first move, but not the move Darius expected. Alexander did not advance forward. Instead, he began moving to the right, slowly, carefully, deliberately. The Macedonian army shifted across the battlefield, maintaining formation, moving step by step. Darius watched from his royal chariot. At first, he did not understand. Why wasn't Alexander attacking? Why was he moving sideways? But then, Darius realized the danger. If Alexander continued moving right, the Persian army would be forced to follow, and if they followed, their lines would stretch, their formation would weaken. Darius ordered his army to move. The Persian cavalry began shifting. The massive Persian line slowly extended, trying to match Alexander's movement. The battlefield widened. The Persian formation stretched further and further. The trap was forming. Alexander continued moving. He studied the Persian lines carefully, watching, waiting, searching. Then he saw it, a gap, a small opening in the Persian center. It was the moment Alexander had been waiting for. Immediately, Alexander turned to his cavalry. The companion cavalry tightened formation. Horsemen moved closer, shields locked, spears lowered. They formed a wedge, a sharp, triangular formation designed to pierce enemy lines. Alexander rode at the front, his armor shining in the sunlight. His soldiers watched him. They knew. This was the decisive moment. Then, Alexander gave the signal. The companion cavalry surged forward. Hooves thundered across the battlefield. Dust exploded into the air. The Macedonian cavalry accelerated. Faster, faster, faster! They were heading straight for the Persian center. Darius saw the charge, the speed, the precision, the suddenness. The Macedonian wedge smashed into Persian lines. The impact was devastating. Persian soldiers struggled to hold formation. Confusion spread. The Macedonian cavalry pushed deeper. Alexander drove straight toward Darius. The Persian center began to buckle. The largest army in the world was beginning to fracture. But at the same time, the Persian cavalry attacked Alexander's left wing. General Parmenion faced enormous pressure. Persian cavalry surrounded his position. The fighting became desperate. Parmenion sent messengers to Alexander, requesting reinforcements. Alexander now faced a difficult decision. Continue attacking Darius, or turn back to help Parmenion. Alexander chose to continue. He knew, if Darius fell, the battle would be over. So Alexander pressed forward, closer, closer, toward the Persian king. The battlefield exploded into chaos. Dust filled the air, horses collided, spears clashed, soldiers fought hand to hand. Alexander pushed deeper. The Persian center began collapsing, and then Darius saw Alexander approaching. The moment of decision had arrived. Alexander drove forward, straight toward the Persian center. The companion cavalry pushed deeper, breaking through Persian lines. Step by step, the thunder of hooves filled the battlefield. Dust rose into the air. Persian soldiers struggled to hold their ground, but the Macedonian wedge kept advancing. Alexander was now getting closer. To King Darius III. From his royal chariot, Darius could see the attack unfolding, the Macedonian cavalry cutting through his center, his soldiers beginning to fall back. Confusion spread across the Persian lines. Messengers rushed back and forth. Officers shouted orders, but the pressure was growing. Alexander's attack was precise, fast, relentless. The Persian center started to collapse. Darius watched the battle unfold. From his elevated position, he saw Macedonian cavalry approaching. Closer, closer, closer. The distance between Alexander and Darius was shrinking. The Persian king hesitated. If Alexander reached him, the battle could end instantly. Around Darius, his guards fought desperately. The Persian immortals formed defensive lines. Royal cavalry moved forward, trying to stop Alexander, but the Macedonian cavalry was unstoppable. Alexander led from the front. His soldiers followed with determination. The Persian lines continued to weaken. More soldiers began to retreat. The center was falling apart. Then, The moment came. Darius made his decision. The Persian king turned his chariot and began to withdraw. At first, slowly, then faster, and finally, Darius fled the battlefield. The moment Darius turned, everything changed. Persian soldiers saw their king retreating. Confusion turned into panic. Officers tried to maintain order, but it was too late. The Persian army began to collapse. Units broke formation. Cavalry began retreating. Infantry dropped their weapons. The largest army in the ancient world was falling apart. Alexander saw Darius fleeing. He pushed forward, attempting to capture the Persian king. The companion cavalry accelerated. They chased the retreating Persians, but the battlefield was chaotic. Dust, fighting, retreating soldiers everywhere. Darius managed to escape. The Persian king fled, leaving his army behind. Meanwhile, on Alexander's left wing, the battle was still raging. Parmenion was still under pressure. Persian cavalry continued attacking. Alexander now made his second decision. He stopped the pursuit and turned back to support Parmenia. The Macedonian cavalry shifted direction. Alexander returned to the battlefield. Persian cavalry, seeing Darius already gone, began retreating. The battle was over. The plains of Gaugamela were now covered in chaos. Persian soldiers fled in every direction. Broken formations, abandoned chariots, fallen banners. The greatest army assembled by Persia had been defeated. Alexander had won. And with this victory, the Persian Empire began to fall. The battle was over, but the consequences were only beginning. The plains of Gaugamela were now filled with retreating Persian soldiers. Broken formations, abandoned chariots, fallen banners scattered across the battlefield. The largest army ever assembled by the Persian Empire had collapsed. Alexander stood victorious, but King Darius III had escaped. The Macedonian cavalry continued pursuing, chasing the fleeing Persian king into the distance. But Darius moved quickly, protected by loyal cavalry. He fled east, leaving behind the heart of his empire. Alexander eventually halted the pursuit. His army was exhausted. The battle had been long and intense. Instead, Alexander turned his attention to what came next, because after Gaugamela, the Persian Empire lay open before him. News of the Persian defeat spread quickly. Cities across Mesopotamia began to surrender. The great city of Babylon opened its gates to Alexander. No resistance, no battle. The ancient capital welcomed him as a liberator. Alexander entered Babylon in triumph. Crowds gathered. The conqueror of Persia had arrived. Alexander was now master of Babylon. But the campaign was not over. Alexander marched south toward the city of Susa, another major Persian capital. When Alexander arrived, Susa surrendered without a fight. Massive treasures fell into Alexander's hands. Gold, silver, royal wealth collected over centuries. Alexander now controlled the wealth of the Persian Empire. But one final symbol remained: Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, the heart of the Persian Empire. Alexander marched toward Persepolis. The city fell. The Persian Empire was finished. King Darius III continued fleeing east, but his empire was already gone. Satraps abandoned him. Generals lost confidence. Eventually, Darius was betrayed by his own commanders. The Persian king was captured and killed. Alexander later found Darius already dead. The last king of Persia had fallen. Alexander ordered Darius buried, with royal honors, even in victory. Alexander respected his enemy. With Darius gone, Alexander became king of Asia. At just 25 years old, Alexander had defeated the greatest empire on earth. From Greece to Egypt to Persia, Alexander ruled a vast empire. The victory at Gaugamela had changed history. One battle, one decision, one charge, and the Persian Empire had fallen. Alexander had become Alexander the Great.